Okay, well, thanks very much for the introductions, and thanks to Jenny for inviting me along this afternoon. I'm delighted to be here. I would have been more delighted had I managed to get across to Cape Town for the conference. I was hoping to get back to South Africa and to Cape Town this year, but this is the next best thing to meet you online. I think I was going to talk about something very similar had I come to Cape Town. I wasn't sure what to talk about when Zenny offered me the opportunity to do this, but I published a book back in September last year, which is about the experiences, the life histories really, of boys I looked after 40 years ago. And I'm hesitating here because I have lost my slides. I've got a picture of myself there instead. So I don't know what's going on there, Randy. Oh, we're back. We're back. Okay, so I'm going to use the book, some of the stories in the book, as a way of reflecting on the history and, as I say, some of the essence of child and youth care. So if you could change now, Randy. Yeah, I think as a profession, child and youth care has shifted its focus. If you look to Canada, for instance, it's moved into all sorts of community-based areas. But for me, the sort of core of residential childcare is in residential childcare. And if you think of some of the core ideas, some of the pioneers, then they all drew on their background in residential childcare to develop those ideas. One of the classic books on residential childcare, which developed the idea of life space, Albert Treichman, Jim Whittaker and Larry Brentro, and the other 23 hours. And of course, the other 23 hours is a challenge to a sort of clinical, medical model of childcare, where you take a kid away and counsel them or treat them or whatever you want to call it for an hour, and then they just get on with their lives. And the message from the book, The Other 23 Hours, is that what happens in the 23 hours that kids are not in treatment or counselling or whatever is actually every bit as important, and I would argue far more important than when they are in that hour, when they're perhaps in a one-to-one session with someone. So what happens when kids are arguing over whose turn it is to do the dishes, when they're just hanging out with staff, when they're engaged in joint activities with staff? Those are where the real work of child and youth care actually happens, not in some sort of clinical setting. Just a wee bit about my own background, and I'll say a wee bit about more about this in a subsequent slide. But I went to the University of Stirling to do my social work qualification, and I went there deliberately because Leon Fulcher, who many of you will know, you'll certainly know the name if you haven't actually met Leon, but Leon was Director of Social Work Education at Stirling at the time, and he introduced me to some of the North American ideas on child and youth care, which really were not around in Scotland or in the UK at that time, and to a large extent they still aren't. But Leon introduced me to ideas of life space. He himself had written a couple of books at the time with Frank Ainsworth, and was developing this idea of group care and drawing on a life space perspective, essentially. And he also introduced me to the writings of Henry Mayer, who had been a sort of mentor of Leon. So you start to see some of the sort of etiology, the connections across generations, if you like, of childcare workers. So Leon was taught by Henry, I think. I was taught by Leon. And I left Stirling, Leon left Stirling and went to work in New Zealand. And we never really came across each other, I don't think, until I had moved into academia. I had moved to the University of Strathclyde, where I said in the introduction, I developed a master's in residential childcare. And out of the blue, I got an email from some guy called Tom Garfat, who, to be honest, I'd never heard of. But he asked me to write a regular column for CYCnet. And Leon had put me in touch, or put Tom in touch with me. And through Tom, I met Brian as well, mostly online. I actually did meet Brian when I came across to South Africa for a conference in 2015. And I've been in regular touch with Martin Stabury ever since. So Tom, Brian, of course, foundational in the field of child and youth care, the kind of work that they did to develop the field and to bring the ideas to a wide audience has been really quite really impressive, actually, and quite exceptional. And again, through connections with CYCnet, I came across guys like Jack Field and Jim Anglin. And these are the big thinkers as far as I'm concerned. I don't see too much coming out. Well, guys like Kiarabaji certainly doing some really good stuff. But some of the big ideas in residential childcare and child and youth care, I still think come from residential childcare and from that kind of background. Okay, Randy? Okay, so some of these big ideas, which I think have been very influential in the way that we think about children, the way that we look after children, they've been tainted in many respects, or the whole idea of residential childcare has been tainted for a number of reasons, I would argue. One is I think that social work as a profession almost set out its stall to avoid the use of residential care. It was influenced by some anti-institutional ideologies, particularly perhaps Irving Goffman's work on institutions, which was very critical of institutional care. And I think that people took that and generalised from it and started to say that all institutional care was bad. And that was a very influential idea that, in social work, as social work developed as a profession. I think just about every country in the world has then had to deal with allegations of historical abuse in residential childcare, which I think was almost a nail in the coffin of residential care, that it's been very hard to sort of come back from that. Now I have my own views on the extent and otherwise of abuse in care and why this story has become such a powerful one. But that's for another day perhaps. But certainly, the whole anti-institutional turn and the discovery of abuse has been very detrimental as far as residential childcare has been concerned. The other thing, and it touches on my own experience, again, I'll come to this, is that much residential care was run by religious charities, religious orders, or certainly religious bodies, and those have moved away from residential care. The religious orders themselves have really declined in numbers, certainly in the sort of developed world. And the state, rightly, has assumed responsibility for social welfare in many countries of the world, certainly, again, the sort of minority world. Okay, so it's hard to think about large group care settings in residential care anymore. Certainly in the West, some of the big institutions, or all of the big institutions, almost have gone. So you've got a whole generation of new workers who don't have the sort of background that you get, I think, from working in a bigger institution where you've got a lot of people around you, where you've got ideas to spark off, and where there were some really quite inspirational figures. So people were having to learn the trade of child and youth care in far more disparate settings now, I think, without the kind of institutional substance which some of the bigger institutions gave. Now, I know that I'm probably in the minority to actually support larger institutions like that, but the reality is that the evidence actually suggests that smaller institutions are not necessarily better than big ones, that there are advantages towards having bigger sort of care settings as well. But I say that at the same time I say that we're not going to go back to them. I think the trend, partly informed by some of the big NGOs, is towards smaller scale residential care, or else no residential childcare at all, and I look to alternative ways of looking after kids, such as fostering. So that's some of the background to what I'm going to talk about. So if you could move on, Randy. Okay, I think I've covered some of this. Yeah, I was going to ask you, well, maybe I will. What is the image of big residential care institutions in South Africa? What is the situation with you? Do you still have big orphanage type settings? Do you have large schools? Do you have, what is the push? What's the political push with regard to residential care? Are you moving away from it? Is there a push to move away from it? Is it still a central feature of childcare provision? Maybe just if anybody wants to shout out or put something into the chat, just to give me an idea of what the situation is.
Mark, if I can come in, it's
Yeah.
Merle Sub speaking. We inherited a system of care in 1994 when we became a liberated country that actually was had predominantly one feature, and that was children's homes for children across all of the then racial groups, because we were separated at that time. And they tend to be in urban settings quite forward thinking, because we had connections with overseas and so on, and in rural settings big and very institutional. And after 1994, when we reformed the law, we tried to move towards smaller institutional settings. But South Africa has been challenged with the cost of residential care over the last, in the democratic years, and because we had the enormous impact on children in our country of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Which left so many millions of children orphaned. So we've had to scale back on residential care, and certainly we're looking at smaller institutions. When I say smaller, probably the biggest I think that is allowed in terms of the law right now is a 60-bed institution. But that's very much smaller than what we had. I know that in the Western Cape, for instance, we had an institution for 600 children in 1994. Right. So that's our situation.
Okay, so a 60-bed institution would still be massively big in the West, certainly in the UK. So that puts it into some sort of perspective. When you say there's a push, a move away from residential care, Meryl, what's it towards? Is it foster care or?
Community-based care.
Community-based care, yeah.
It came with the Isibindi project, placing child and youth care workers in families and so on. But that is theoretically the focus of attention, obviously with a limited budget to reach more children.
Yeah. So what about all the HIV orphans? Where are they supported?
Mostly in family and kinship care, actually.
Kinship,
Some in
yeah,
residential care,
yeah,
but we have really earnestly tried since 1994 to make sure that children do not come into residential care for reasons of poverty or orphanhood. But
yeah.
of course, that unfortunately still does happen.
Sure, sure. And of course, the irony is that residential care does become more expensive the smaller the units become. There's probably a financial advantage in some of the bigger units, but that's not an argument for them, but it's a reality. I think Leon Fulcher has just recently published a paper just stating that reality in most countries in the world, actually, that it's just not feasible to move away entirely from residential care and into family settings for all sorts of financial and cultural reasons. So, okay, that's helpful context, Meryl. Thanks for that. Do you want to just move on then, Randy? I see some of the, yeah.
Yeah, some in the chat box, Mark.
Yes, I see that,
Okay.
yeah.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, I've got that. I understand that, I think. Okay, just a wee bit more about myself. As the introduction said, that I was a residential care worker and manager in the Listee schools, which would have been the approved schools that you inherited as well, the reform schools, and in secure accommodation. I did develop the first Masters in Residential Care at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. So I've got substantial practice experience to draw on, which I developed through academic experience. But the first 8 years of my life, or my career, was spent at what I'm calling St Roch's. That's not the real name. But it was an industrial school, essentially a Listee school in Scotland, they were called. And it was run by a Catholic order, the De La Salle brothers, originally a French order, but quite a big presence in Scotland and England and Ireland from the 19th century onwards. And the mission of the order was to teach the children of the poor. I don't know how people know the differentiation. They weren't priests, the brothers weren't priests or even monks. They did take vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and association of living together. They worked without pay. They used to pool resources. So it was very much a sort of vocation, calling to look after poor kids. And, I had a very good experience there. I was and didn't join the order. There was very few brothers left by the time that I actually started in residential care. But the headmaster and the deputy were still brothers when I did start, and there were one or two others. But brothers died off. The religious life became far less attractive, and they moved into other areas, those religious who did sort of remain. Most of the schools closed down. Those remaining became sort of private residential schools, and those haven't really flourished in Scotland particularly. But my own time working for our brothers and working in residential school was actually really positive. I got to spend a lot of my time playing football, going camping, going cycling with kids, doing a lot of things that I enjoyed and I enjoyed doing with them. So I have these good experiences, these good memories, and I actually don't recognise some of the stories of awful residential care. And the reality is that 2 or 3 of the institutions that I've worked in actually are identified as being problematic, of having, encountered abuse, which I'd have to say that I never really saw at all. I saw practice which is different than it would be now, but I never saw any overt abuse. And as I say, my own overall experience of the schools was positive. Okay, Randy, do you want to move on? However, from the last 20 odd years, the whole story about residential care, certainly in the sort of Western world, the Anglophone world, is that the schools were awful places. That there's somebody writing in a newspaper here, abuse in religiously run schools was systemic, pervasive, chronic, excessive, arbitrary, and endemic. Boys were routinely starved, beaten, humiliated, sexually abused, deprived of education and basic knowledge about life, and their emotional needs were often totally neglected. And the same author goes on to say it's beyond question that the entire industrial and reformatory regime was an abusive and cruel one. So essentially what I do in the book that I'm going to talk about is really to take some of Harry Ferguson's claims there, that boys were routinely starved, beaten, humiliated, sexually abused, deprived of education, and actually question those. And question those through the evidence and the stories of boys who I looked after there. In Scotland, a former pupil of a De La Salle school became a sort of cause célèbre. He wrote a book called The Sense of Freedom, and in which he described the brothers as paedophile monks. As I say, they weren't monks. Psychopaths, brutal monsters who stalked the corridors. That every child who sort of went through their doors was damaged by that experience, and that there was a conspiracy of silence which allowed that kind of regime to continue. Now, again, I can quite honestly say that I never saw any of that, and most people, I don't know anybody who did, to be honest. So there is a story out there which has become a very powerful story, but it clashes, it's dissonant with the experiences of most of us, I think, who actually worked in the schools, and indeed most of those kids who went through them. Okay, Randy. Yeah, so we've got this story, and as Chimamanda Adichie says, the single story, and it has become a single story in respect of residential care, it creates stereotypes. The problem with stereotypes, not that they're untrue, but they're incomplete. They make one story the only story. And I think my view would be that the abuse narrative has become about the only story in residential childcare. Very sort of powerful one, which has determined the sort of status and the future direction of residential care, I think. However, a lot of the writers on scandal and social work suggest that beneath any one story, beneath any master narrative, there are other voices offering alternative accounts. So I'm not questioning that there was some abuse in institutions. What I'm questioning is this singular story which has taken hold. And people are starting to question it. I'm certainly questioning it. But in Canada, you've got a legal anthropologist, Ron Neeson, who's challenging the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. And he's written a book called Truth and Indignation. And I'm involved with a number of other Canadians who are really trying to bring a historical perspective to the schools and who are challenging some of the narrative that has been laid down about the schools. It's particularly powerful in Canada, I think, where you have some of the Indigenous population making claims about the residential schools there, and about really sort of horrendous stories about kids being buried in unmarked graves and murdered in the schools. The reality is that there is no evidence of that, not a shred actually. Okay, but so this dissonance between my experience both as a practitioner but also as an academic and the sort of story that I encounter on a day-to-day basis has always been the prompt for me to start to look a bit more deeply into what the reality of residential schools was. Okay, Randy? Okay, Richard Webster, who's written a book on residential care and the sort of policy context and the abuse narrative, says that when one story takes hold, there's only one way to undo its influence, and that's to document how the narrative has achieved such power, how that narrative was created in the first place. Is to tell another story, to tell the story of the story. In some ways, that's what I set out to do in the book I'm going to talk about. So I set out to do two things: to tell a different story of residential school, or at least of the school that I talk about, and to propose how the story, the current dominant story, has been constructed. I'm not going to go too much into that today, but I will touch on it. But I also want to draw out some features of good residential childcare and good child and youth care across contexts. So I offer a counter narrative which is described as the stories which people tell and live, which offer resistance either implicitly or explicitly to dominant cultural narratives. So I'm challenging that dominant cultural narrative through drawing on the stories of boys, men, who I looked after in the course of the 1980s. Okay, Randy? Okay, I've no idea why this is only on half a slide, it shouldn't be. But so how did the book come about? Well, I was actually watching one of my sons playing football about probably 8 to 10 years ago. And one of the coaches for the other team, a guy I'm calling Stu, he was a former St. Joe's boy, and we met when I was actually a coach. He was a coach on the other side, and we started talking. And he set up a Facebook page, and there's now 28 members. It's actually sort of a bit moribund at the moment because Stu actually died a year or so ago. He was the mainstay who kept it going. So I used some of this Facebook page to reconnect with boys that I looked after in the 1980s. I've used some of the entries from the Facebook posts. In research terms, what I do is just really, this is sort of magpie approach, what the literature calls bricolage, bringing together whatever you can to actually support the research. So I draw on a number of sources of evidence, if you like. So I interviewed 7 former pupils in life history method. I would have interviewed more, but it was COVID had intervened and I didn't want to do interviews online. I wanted to do them face to face. So I stopped at the 7. I interviewed 2 surviving brothers. And as I say, I picked up bits and pieces from elsewhere in terms of the kind of data that I draw upon. Purists would say it was dirty data. It wasn't, as pure research as perhaps could have been. Although I think it was. I don't know how you do pure research, 40 years down the line. So it's case study research as well. But it also brought me to the centre of the research, and that, in research terms, so it might be classed as autoethnography, which is an approach to research and writing, seeks to describe and systematically analyse personal experience in order to understand cultural experience. So you're looking to explain broader phenomena through personal experience. So through my experience of working in the schools and trying to make sense of the wider history, if you like, of residential schools. So I might compare and contrast personal experience against existing research. So there's this sort of constant coming and going. Okay, Randy. Okay, that's try to get the front page of my book in there. I'm actually useless at PowerPoint. So I've given a couple of of the views that people, a couple of friends actually, what they said about the book. It is getting some pretty good reviews actually, not as many as it could because the publishers haven't been particularly good at actually getting it out to people. But it does, the 2 quotes there really just say that what the book is doing is challenging some of the history or the dominant story of residential care. Okay, Randy. Yeah, just going back to the title of the book there. I wanted to call it The Best Years of Our Lives, because that's the way that so many of the boys I spoke to actually described it. They spoke about their time in St. Roch's as the best days of their lives. The publisher thought that I shouldn't have that as the main title, presumably because they wanted the main title to say what the book was about, but it's a sort of subtitle. But that was a powerful sort of message that came out of so many of the interviews. Almost all of them were saying, yeah, I loved it, they're best days of my life. So as I say, I interviewed 2 brothers, former brothers, and 7 boys. So brother Lawrence, brother Felix, again, I've changed these names. Stu, Brian, Dom, Billy, Darren, Ricky and Kieran. Okay then, Randy. That's the layout of the book, the chapters here. And Martin Stabley was good enough to do a foreword for me, and it's a lovely piece of writing actually, and it really sort of sets up the book very nicely, I think. And for me it was important to have Martin's sort of view there, because many of you will know that Martin himself was brought up in care, and he speaks warmly and powerfully about that experience in the foreword, and I think it does actually tee up the rest of the book very nicely. So I give some sort of background, some sort of history of the schools, of the role of the De La Salle order in running the schools, and then really look at boys' experiences before they came into care, during care, picking out themes of education and care itself, looking at ideas of discipline, of abuse, and of their trajectories after they leave care. And then in the final 2 chapters, I do try and make sense of the dissonance, if you like, between the 2 very different versions of care that I spoke about earlier. Okay, Randy. Yeah, so I draw on some of these sort of middle chapters, if you like, to use some quotes from boys to draw out some themes. Okay, again, Randy. Okay, but before I do that, just again a wee bit about this sort of background. I adopted a life history approach, and the rationale, the justification for that is that I think we all make sense of our lives through stories. We organise our experiences and our memories in the form of narrative. And that's how we make sense of ourselves and of the world around us. But those stories aren't fixed, but they're affirmed, reaffirmed, modified, recreated in their telling. So you rarely tell that same story the same way, the next time you tell it, because in telling it, you're actually changing that story. So in that sense, narrative work is about shifting identities. It involves people telling and constructing their identity, telling their stories, but also constructing their identities through the process of telling their stories. That means that there can be a tenuous connection between a story and an event. It's rarely a sort of direct mapping on. So there's rarely a truth to be got at, but a sort of interpretation of experience. So when I talk about these stories, I realise that they're developed in a particular context. People might tell the stories of their very similar experiences or the same experiences. They might tell of those experiences in very different ways. That's the nature of a sort of narrative approach. It doesn't mean that one is true and the other is false. They all probably contain elements of their own truth. And that, again, makes it difficult to hang on to that sort of single story which we're led to believe defines residential care. So we've got a whole range of stories, and what I'm doing is bringing some of the stories that we rarely hear about in the sort of kind of press coverage of residential care, and bringing some of those stories to the surface. But we're not free to tell any story. We're sort of confined by the cultural scripts that we have available to. Sorry, I'm looking at some of the comments there. Looking at some of the cultural scripts that define the story that people can tell. So when the dominant story is one of having been abused in residential care, you can imagine that people might write themselves into that story because they're trying to make sense of their own sort of life situations, their own life circumstances. Okay, Randy. So, as I said earlier, I'm picking up on some of the quote that I gave earlier from Harry Ferguson, and he says that kids were deprived of education and basic knowledge about life. And what people were saying was a bit different from that, because there was a different educational ethos. I don't think the residential schools set out to get kids qualifications to get them to university. I don't think they would have stopped kids going to university. They would have been delighted if they did. But we took kids who had disrupted educational experiences anyway before they came into the school. So the idea was really to re-enthuse them, to give them an educational experience that they actually enjoyed. So most of them didn't go on to higher education, further education. A couple did actually. But the reality was, there was an educational philosophy, which I think was one of the, came from the brothers themselves. And Felix, who is deputy head, said of that philosophy that was to ensure each child reached their potential academically, spiritually, physically. So it took in the ordinary subjects that you had in school, an emphasis on religious study, a powerful emphasis on games or physical education. And that was basically it. And school was a place that kids should enjoy. It wasn't a question of going to school because they had to. Hopefully they would go to school because that's what they wanted to do. And that was basically my feeling about the whole thing. So the whole philosophy was not about getting kids through qualifications and examinations. It was actually giving them an experience that they wanted to take part in. And actually, you're not going to get kids through examinations unless you can enthuse them, unless you can get them into the classroom in the first place and actually become enthused by education. So I think that was a kind of philosophy which underpinned what we did. And one of the boys here, James, saying he enjoyed classes, he liked metalwork, woodwork, so very practical subjects, go-karting, all that kind of thing. Whereas in his normal school, it was always writing, never any practical stuff like woodwork, metalwork. So hours and hours of that, and it was actually good. So philosophy, I think, was one of social education, which was a central sort of social welfare philosophy in Scotland, the idea of social education. So it was about an education which went beyond the classroom, and some of the examples that Felix gave was of one of the teachers reaching out to Vietnamese refugees to Scotland at the time, what were called boat people at the time, working with older people in local old people's homes, a lot of outdoor pursuits. We had an outdoor pursuits teacher who would do everything with kids, all sorts of outdoor trips. I was involved in a whole number of cycling trips, camping trips, and some of those were abroad. We took kids to the De La Salle Mother House in Rome. We took them to North America, to North Africa. So there's all sorts of trips that were involved. So as I say, it wasn't focused on qualification. And the reality is that some of the evidence that we do have is that kids can actually go back to education, kids who have been in care. They tend not to get the qualifications at the time, but if you have enthused them, if you've got, given them some sort of educational experience, they can go back. And as I say, a couple of the kids I interviewed did. Okay, Randy? Care. The dominant view of care was that kids were routinely starved, emotional needs were often totally neglected. And here you've got all these boys, and all of them spoke about this idea of love, of family. I loved it. It was like a family. I felt it was a bit more like home. Get your slippers and your jammies on. The house mother all the time being like your mum. I loved it. I really did. Loved it. I don't know, maybe because I was used to being with parents who weren't there for me. Others spoke about a good feeling, a warm feeling, of wanting to be there and feeling cared for. It's kind of nice, warm feeling. And a lot of that feeling sort of picked up by being around particular individuals. So Kevin here speaks about Brother Barnabas. He made me feel safe. We'd just have a laugh. I was small and first time there, so Brother Barnabas, big strong man, made him feel safe. Felt safe with him, and it grew a bond that only like a father and son, a father would sort of be like. And then if you're unwell, if you're sick, then the house mother would bring you up soup and tea to check you're all right, and she'd let you sleep. So some of the symbolism of care actually expressed through things like food, but also just that sort of relational context of care as well, which came through. But what was really powerful was that sense of just that warm feeling of feeling cared for through the everyday sort of aspects of life, getting your slippers and jammies on, just being able to relax and feel sort of cared for. Okay, Randy? Okay, this sort of contentious area about discipline abuse. Again, Harry Ferguson says it was systemic, pervasive, chronic, excessive, this was Bunting, arbitrary and endemic, that kids were beaten, humiliated, sexually abused. And here's the boys saying there was never any violence, staff were always nice enough. The odd fight like anything else, but it was done and over, and that was it, finished. But the staff, none of them were ever aggressive, never ever. I can't remember one ever being aggressive. And another one of the lads, Dom, I think, saying, don't get me wrong, sometimes if you step over the line, they maybe got taken by the scruff of the neck. But remember, we weren't angels. And I think that's important context. These were kids who were streetwise, who, could sort of act out. And they did need some sort of discipline and control at times. Dom says they were little animals. I wouldn't go that far, but so it wasn't a case of, well, calm down, because there was no calming you down. Sometimes there was physical restraint, and that was the nature of the sort of experience. This notion that it was a conspiracy of silence that allowed abuse to go on, and Craig's saying to me there, see, I've thought about it, Mark, right, and Ken, I racked my head and my brain, because you read all this stuff and you're obviously going to think, was there anything that went on, and I can't think of anything where I felt uncomfortable. And of course, I felt the same. I've racked my brain to say, was there stuff I missed? Was it really that bad? Could it have been bad in places where I wasn't at different points in time? But I'm not convinced it was. Okay, next slide, Randy. Okay, looking back, again, most of the boys look back very fondly on their times. They're desperate to actually go back down and spend some time in the school, which is now closed, but still exists. The building still exists. And here's Andy quoting on Facebook, this is long overdue, but to all the brothers and members of staff that gave us the upbringing we got from you, thanks. Your influence made myself and many others the people we are today. And then Craig, I think, saying, for me, it was something really positive. It kind of ended my time in care well. Okay, Randy. When trying to make sense of some of the sort of subsequent claims that have been made about residential childcare, very interestingly, I think, because people don't take this into account, is context, that the boys that I was speaking to left care in the sort of early 90s. And if you think back, then in Scotland, certainly, then that was a period where drugs became a major issue. Don't know if, you know, how much people know about some of the Scottish literature or film, but Trainspotting, the Irvine Welsh sort of book that depicted the sort of drugs scene in Edinburgh in the late 1980s. And they're saying that, you know, people might think, well, actually, kids turn to drugs because of their experiences in care. And what the boys were saying, it wasn't to do with their experiences in care. It was actually leaving care left a void in their lives, and drugs were there, and drugs filled that void. Very different perspective, actually. If you look at things, you know, just from a different perspective, then you come to very different conclusions, or you can come to very different conclusions. And they're saying that, you know, it wasn't because of St. Joe's that they got into drugs, or St. Roch's. It was they got into drugs because the structure of St. Roch's was taken from them. And then into that, what you get is the lawyers coming in and supporting claims, and the prospect of money coming from those claims. And of course, the irony of that is that if people are given money without the requisite supports, then it's going to go back into drug use. It's a crazy system we've got ourselves into, I think. Okay, moving on, Randy. Okay, again, just some sort of sense that you've got state institutions which have been set up to actually, you know, deal with this issue of abuse in care, which in many respects has actually been driven by lawyers and by sort of global human rights discourses about redress. So in Ireland, you have a redress board which is given out massive sums of money, and in Scotland the whole push was to get a similar redress scheme to Ireland, and we just got it in the past year. Actually, in Scotland it's taken a lot longer, but any kid who has actually been in care can claim £10,000 here. They don't have to, you know, prove abuse or anything else. They just have to prove that they were actually in care, which is a step forward from some of the Canadian situation where it was discovered retrospectively that about 40% of those who made claims of having been abused in care weren't actually in care. So the whole thing has become incredibly politicised and driven by lawyers. So it creates an incentive for people to identify as a victim and as a survivor. Okay, next slide, Randy. Okay, so how do we make sense of this? You know, and Brian is saying there, he doesn't understand that gap. I took this idea of a narrative gap from a chapter in a book, can't remember what it was called, but it was talking about a woman whose mother had been brought up in care, and she's saying, I don't recognise the gap between the dominant narrative and the stories my mum tells me about having been in care. Okay, so in research terms, again, in epistemological terms, then you've got a shift away from evidence, from a sort of realist approach. And I would support that for the most part, actually. But you've got turn to narrative, and as I say, I'm using narrative. The irony is that I think there are, you know, that can be taken too far. And the whole push, certainly in the UK, and I suspect in America, I don't know about South Africa, is a move towards listening to lived experience. But as I said earlier, Our lived experience is actually created in a social context, and we're not free to tell any story. We draw on the dominant narrative scripts that our culture makes available to us. So potentially you're starting to identify, or you see people identifying as victims and as survivors, because that is the narrative script which our culture makes available to us. So you've got a boundary between fiction and autobiography that's complex and shifting. Okay, moving on, Randy. And yeah, I think our current culture is one which looks towards stories of victimhood. If you go into an airport lounge, that's what all the stories are about. You know, there are stories that push our buttons. So this idea of, you know, where some of my thinking on residential care has taken me is towards questioning some of the big sort of discourses of the day. The big one for us, or one of the big ones at the moment, being trauma, which once you start to explore starts to become more problematic as well, something that can be questioned. Okay, Randy. And this is just, you know, to support that aspect of the story from another former St. Roch's kid. And he went on to become a filmmaker, actually, and was writing scripts, sort of gritty scripts about his experiences growing up. And one of those experiences was about being abused in residential care. And I got back to him and said, look, Jamie, tell me about this. Did it really happen? And he said, well, no, but, and then he goes on to say it was based on an experience that happened to somebody else that I can't remember if I'd witnessed it, or with me being young, you don't know what you remember. So this notion that as a former resident of a residential care home, there's this cachet that attaches to presenting yourself as a victim. And of course, he went on to say that actually the victim story is not a good one. It's one that you can't get out of either. It sticks you in a particular place. Okay, Randy? Yeah, trying to make sense of why people tell very different stories. I think there's sociological literature which might suggest that it's to do with different dispositions. People who you want to be seen as, exhibiting a dignity culture, as, being fairly stoic, and those who sort of buy into a victim culture. So very different sort of personality types will understand their stories in different ways. Again, Randy? Do you want to move on from this one? I've touched on it. I'm going to try and conclude now. Again, if you can move on from that, people can have the slides. Okay, so what I was going to try and do is just try and draw sort of lessons for child and youth care, draw together some themes about what might constitute good residential or good child and youth care practice. I think the context of that is that we're being pushed, I suspect fairly globally, towards sort of systematic ways of doing residential childcare programs. If you go into Facebook, people will be trying to sell you a program about how to do anger management or trauma or whatever else. And that, for me, just reflects the dominance of psychology as a profession, of psychological ways of understanding things. And I don't think those fit with child and youth care. They don't provide us with the kind of platform, the kind of knowledge base that would actually support the profession, I don't think. I remember reading an article, probably about 20 years old now, about the eternal verities of residential care, the eternal truths. What's the foundations that are never going to go away, that are always going to be part of what we do. And you know, some of those I think have formed and been reinforced in writing the book that I've been speaking about. I've not provided enough evidence, I don't think, from the book to support them, but I think it is there. And it's where I'm going in terms of some of my thinking, that what is really important is adult confidence and authority when working with kids. You heard stories about adults not going over the top, but there being an authority, there being an order in the place. And I think when adults are confident, then it's less likely almost that you'll have aggression from them or violence within the residential context, because I think that provides a sense of psychological containment. The other thing for me is that residential care, education, child and youth care practice, by its nature, is socio-educational. It's not clinical. We can leave the clinical stuff to psychologists, but what we've got to do is to develop a basis for child and youth care, which I think is socio-educational. It's about doing everyday things with kids in a way that they can grow and learn from. And you know, I think the European idea of social pedagogy captures some of that. A sense of care that, you know, the kind of care that we offered in St. Roch's, it wasn't a sort of sentimental care. It was very practical. It was expressed through everyday events like making sure that kids had sort of warm beds and good clothing, good food. But it was felt. The kind of rhythms and routines that we offered, I think, fed into a sense of kids feeling cared for. I've already touched on it not being clinical, but I like Tom Garfat's idea of just hanging out with kids. When child and youth care work are engaged with each other in everyday tasks, again, that's taken us back to Henry Mayer. Joint experiences constitute the essence of development. It's when you're doing things together that you get this socio-educational experience. And you do that very often through activities, through playing sports with kids, through board games, through, you know, going on holidays with them, through just being with them, through hanging out with them. The importance of relationships, one of the things that came through in the book was the importance of relationships with peers as well as with staff, but both were really important. Humour, you know, one of the things that kids spoke about was just the laughs, you know, and I detail some of that. There's other laughs that I just don't feel I could even write about in this current climate, but which were only laughs. But the other powerful thing that came through, and I'll finish here, is just how important me getting back in touch with the boys was, and them getting back in touch with me, and how enduring the relationships that formed 40 years ago were. The way that they spoke fondly about people who had looked after them, that they were really keen to reconnect with. And you're reconnecting at a different level, on a different basis. But there's something there which, that connection between us over time, is really important. I wrote a wee bit about this in the piece for CYC Online a year or so ago. But I'll finish there, actually. I think, is that my last slide, is it, Randy? Yep. Okay, I'll finish there and we can maybe have some questions. Some good quotes there, some good, yeah.
Mark, you want us to have some questions now?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, yes. Thank you very much for sharing your research with us. I see there, there was someone just opened his camera now. And thank you for kind of also in the end, you showed us what does the stories tell, you know, us about the importance of child and youth care. But from my side, I think when you opened the session, you actually took us back and remind us of our pioneers in the field and we as child and youth care workers in these days are also fortunate to have met, a lot of them at our conferences and on other platforms. But we will, the first question that I've noticed there that someone asked was, how many years were children in care that you have done your research with?
Yeah, it varied. They were could be for up to 4 years. It was secondary school, so they were admitted, or they could be admitted from about 12 onwards. And if they were admitted at 12, they could stay for up to 4 years. If they were admitted at 14, then it would be a couple of years. The ones that I interviewed, most of them had been there for at least 2 or 3 years.
Okay, yes, thanks. We also open the session. If anybody's got a question, you're welcome to raise your hand. I don't see any hands at this stage. Oh, yes, I see there, Donald, he would like to make a comment, and then I'm going to also ask Zeni to come in. The two of them have made a few comments there in the chat box, and then I also see Merle. Let's start in with Donald.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this comprehensive presentation and also sharing your book with us. There is a lot that we have heard, and I'm sure that when people read it, they will be reading it with a very good background of what it's about. And unless I have missed it, because now and then I had some connectivity challenges, how many young people participated in your research when you were writing this book?
Yeah, 7 sort of main participants, and I drew upon a few things from Facebook, from others as well, and from different conversations I had had at different points, but 7 core participants amongst the former pupils.
Thank you.
I would say go ahead, Mel. Your hand is up. Unmute.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair, for this opportunity. And thank you, Mark, for a very interesting presentation. I think that the issue that we are faced with here in South Africa is that we have very little research on the outcomes of residential care. And we have very little research on actually what is taking place in residential care at the moment. And I think it's one of the things as NACCW that we would like to engage in further. And I think that your methodology of actually lifting this kind of ethnography approach is a very interesting one. Because I think that we could very easily trace back young people who've been in care, and also get some of those stories, understanding a little bit of our sort of pre-1994 history and our post-1994 history. So I just thought it was a very, very interesting presentation from that point of view, and I think really just challenges us to look at actually researching this area much more. And the other thing I wanted to comment on was that when you talked about young people experiencing a sense of care, is I think that it's one of the things that we in our child and youth care centers in South Africa often get right. We create an environment in which young people do feel cared for. And I think it's a very difficult thing to do in our context, because we I think more so than in other countries, we have to be very sure to make sure that experience of feeling cared for is not an experience of luxury as well, when children come from poverty and are probably going to return into impoverished communities. But I think that we do that quite well. But again, we don't have the evidence for that. And I think that we don't have in our country a narrative that supports that. I think that there is also still a sense of there's kind of something a little bit questionable about institutional care. And really, I think that we should be doing something about that, because I think it also impacts on individual child and youth care workers who I think feel that their work is a little bit devalued, because actually the entire endeavor is not highly regarded. And we all know that doing good residential care, those of us who've been in residential care know how hard it is to get it right always. And so, you know, we have so many people in our country who should be lauded and, you know, really praised for what it is that they are doing, and yet are not getting that sense of appreciation for what they're doing in South African society. So I think that is something that I picked up from what you had said. And then your point about aftercare, and our legislation makes allowance for aftercare, but there's very little financial support for aftercare. So we often drop kids at that time when they become vulnerable, and moving out of an institutional care where there is a sense of support into a kind of nothingness. And I think many child and youth care centers try very hard to make that transition a more positive one and a supportive one for young people. So just those comments. Thank you very much.
I think that's a really sort of key comment about how residential care workers are able to articulate what they do. And you know, that's where some of my work is going at the moment. It's, you know, conceptualizing, I think, residential care is a moral practical task. So it's guided by a moral purpose, and it involves getting your hands dirty and actually doing things with kids. Whereas a lot of the kind of knowledge that we valorize is a more technical, rational, or scientific one. So we look to be able to measure the outcomes of care, you know, and the number of qualifications that kids get. But how do you measure, you know, the right word spoken at the right time, or a gesture which actually, you know, is imperceptible but which is meaningful to, you know, a particular kid? And I think we, you know, one of the things I'm trying to do just now is think about how you think differently about what constitutes evidence of outcomes, or, you know, and I think Tom and Leon have done some stuff about that, but I think they were still trying to measure it. I would go further and say, actually, you shouldn't need to measure it, you feel it, you know. And,
yeah. Great point. Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I see this Portia has come on. I don't know whether she wanted to speak, so I'll turn my camera off. Thank you.
Yeah. Now we got to give Nissia. I see your hand is up. Let's give you a chance. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let me just put my screen on. Oh, I don't look so great. You know, I'm going to just put this off.
Okay.
So, you know what I wanted to ask? Firstly, thank you so much for that presentation. I was listening very closely because I'm the monitoring and evaluation person at NACCW. And at the moment, just as Mo was saying, we're expanding our research interests within the sector, especially as child and youth care literature in South Africa is hugely underrepresented. However, we have so many child and youth care workers in the country, a lot of child and youth care workers deployed in child and youth care centers, but little is known, you know, about the richness of information that they're sitting on. So we're looking at expanding our own research, you know, with children, with caregivers. And I suppose this is a broad question, and you sort of already answered it here and there, but you know, what would be sort of advice, you know, key things that you would share with researchers going into this field, speaking to children, supported by child and youth care workers, either in schools, in residential care, or in communities, when they want to get, you know, information directly from the children themselves? Sorry, and also, in particular, child survivors or victims of abuse and neglect.
Yeah. I think one of the problems is that a lot of research that is done from a particular perspective, and researchers are rarely child and youth care workers. I think there's a sort of structural problem that, you know, very few child and youth care workers would feel confident enough to do research, or to do research that they would call research. But the other ones, I think the autoethnographic approach is actually the best one, you know, that we can bring to this. If people can feel confident enough about bringing together their own experiences with those of the kids that they're working with, talking with, and then are able to sort of co-construct some of the interpretations of those conversations, I think that's where you're going to get rich stuff. Otherwise, I think you've got people coming in, asking questions with a particular understanding of the kind of answers they want, and kids themselves know what kind of answers that people are looking for. So you don't get some of the richness. So I think the richness comes when you can naturalize some of the opportunities to actually gather those stories. And they are stories. You know, they're the stories of the kids who, you know, whose stories start to interlink with our own stories. And that's where I think some of the real powerful knowledge sort of emerges from. With regard to the second part of your question, you know, how do you get those stories from people, you know, kids who have been abused or whatever? I think child and youth care workers do that all the time anyway. So, you know, if that becomes just part of people's story, then you don't tiptoe around it so much. You know, it's there. And, you know, very often child and youth care workers and kids have had that kind of conversation. I think it's harder to get that kind of information if you're coming in as a researcher from the outside and you're trying to get that, you know, from scratch, because I think that would require a particular sensitivity. It might not be appropriate. It might not be appropriate at a particular moment in time. But I think if, you know, the forum for that knowledge coming out is a more naturalistic one, then I think that's where you'll get that really rich stuff. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, it does very much. Especially that point what you said now, they're basically collecting in a way that information on a daily basis all the time. Yeah. It's just a matter of, you know, how we, you know. Yeah. That's very interesting. Thank you.
If I can just come in.
Your research, actually, because we think that research is done by researchers and it's done in a very sort of rarefied sort of situation. And I'm not sure that's the best way to do it. Sorry, I'm cutting across you, Zenny.
Yeah, no, I know that Portia needs to come on next, but I just wanted to follow up on what you were saying and Nithya was saying is that quite often we find there's a richness in stories that come in the life space. Yeah. It's sort of when the childcare worker is in that situation, helping that child, the child responds, and is there a possibility of stopping for that moment? And what is it? Somehow asking the child to elaborate on that experience, and in that way gathering a story with the richness of that moment. And of course, their story might say you repeatedly handle it like this, and it's helped me to, or whatever. It would be interesting to see how we could get that methodology, because the child and youth care workers do gather
Yes.
a lot of that they share in reports that they present.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I did an article with my wife. We foster a asylum-seeking refugee kid now, and the very act of looking after them has been really insight, led to a number of real insights from us, insights that we couldn't get through a research situation, a traditional research situation, but which gave us insights into the needs, the situations of asylum seekers in a way that no conventional piece of research could. So we wrote that up as an article after the event, but very much involved Faisal, so name we're giving him, or one of the names we've given him, in that process. So we're saying, remember this, do you mind if we write about it? And we've written that up in an article. I'm hoping to actually do that in book form soon as well. Sorry, I'm keeping going here.
Yes. Portia, could you please put on your camera and ask your question? You were on next. Portia, are you there?
Yeah, it looks like she maybe pressed something wrong. I see there's another hand
Yes.
that we've got. I can't see the name now. Zini, can you see?
Yes. Go ahead. Put on your camera and unmute and speak. I think it's Nandamiso. Please do. Your hand is up. It's okay.
Ndomukana. Yeah.
There you are.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. Thank you, Mark, for insightful presentation. My first question would be, in terms of a supporting system after a child has the exit plan after the child has left a residential area, okay? In your country or other countries, how well is the supporting system in terms of ongoing support? In some cases, we may find that once a child leaves, I'm not saying most of the cases, in some cases, we find that the child, once he or she leaves the center, then the old behavior tends to come back. The second question, in terms of your scope of work, the research, how wide did it go, or has there ever been a research regarding children and youth in conflict with the law, okay, in terms of the end results and the supporting system? Because I've been sitting here listening, okay, it has been residential. Now my curiosity went on the other side in terms of children in conflict with the law, okay?
Yeah.
How great has that gone, or it hasn't started yet? And then the last question, in terms of child and youth care work, I'm going to the actual workers, okay? Would you say the field, the profession? Because looking at the team, we are reflecting now, looking back, where it all started. Now, in terms of individual, the workers themselves, would you say the profession is moving forward, or
Okay.
still is there progress or not in terms of development and growth and recognition of the profession in other countries? Because here in South Africa, it's a total different situation. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, could you give me 30 seconds? I'll be back. I've just got to answer something there. Be with you in a minute.
And while we're waiting for Mark, I just hope that Portia will find herself back in to ask her question after this one's answered.
I also see there's a comment here from Harold Slubbert. I'm reminded about a young person that was in care who many years later meets you in the mall and reminds you about what it was you said, that helped them make a different choice about their behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there are a lot of good stories we can actually about, children reflect and give back to us later on.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. Just somebody just came to the door there. Okay, there was three aspects to that question. One was about aftercare. Basically, I think, as Meryl suggested, we actually have a fairly good system of aftercare now legislatively. And it's reasonably well resourced, actually. So that's been one of the few improvements, I think, in child and youth care recently in the last 10 years, maybe 15 years in Scotland. So there is a lot of support available. Not all kids avail of it, and many of them do go back to the kind of sort of circumstances that they came from. I think probably not that many get into decent employment, the kind of thing that might actually see them through. And so they do go back to situations that are not necessarily conducive. Kids in conflict with the law, I was trying to think, there's been a lot of work there as well. We have reduced our youth offending population. And again, there's been a fair bit of work in terms of trying to support kids in conflict with the law. In the context of our reducing demographic, our population of 16 to 18-year-olds who would be in conflict with the law. So it's difficult to say whether the demographic change is actually influencing things or whether kids' behaviour is, conflicting with the law is actually improving. Maybe a bit of both. So yeah, I think we have tried to, take most kids out of the criminal justice system, and we're moving that sort of up to 18 now in Scotland from 16. It's still an issue, but in terms of a professional way forward, I think we've missed so many tricks in Scotland. We invested very heavily in 2000 in residential childcare, and that's how I came into academia and developed a master's. But I think we've not had enough sort of good thinking, and we have gone down a number of wrong roads, I think, in terms of how we might have made residential childcare better. So in terms of where the profession stands, I'm not entirely optimistic. We spoke at one point about having a degree level profession. I think there's arguments for and against that. But we didn't go down that road. They just withdrew the proposal for a degree level. So I don't get a sense that there's many people who are thinking about residential care who are actually taking things forward. And so I'm not entirely optimistic. So I suspect similar across different countries. Okay.
Thank you, Mark. I see our next question is from Donald. Donald, over to you.
No, it must be an old hand, Chair. I'm sorry.
Okay. Mark, we've just got a question. Where is the book available?
I'd have to sort of confess that I wouldn't recommend anybody gets the book because it's priced at a really silly figure. It's over £100, and I seriously wouldn't recommend anybody gets it. I have some proofs. And I mean, the idea, I think, is that it might be come out in paperback in the next number of months or year. I hope so, because that might make it manageable for some people. Yeah, Jack Phelan's written a review of it. Martin has seen it. I mean, I could probably let one or two people have a copy of proofs. But yeah, as I say, I wouldn't recommend anybody buying it.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can just follow up on that, it'll be wonderful if we could, from NACCW, have a copy of the proof, because I think that from what Nasir was saying and others, I think it's been very inspiring hearing from you. And I think that others are thinking, but we've got stories too. We know children. Why can't we tell our stories, and maybe rather in our case then one person do a piece of research, which could happen. Maybe we can look at from NACCW, drawing on your expertise and this webinar, gather stories from the field. And
Yeah.
if everybody gave one story, or geographically two from each province, and would want to share and participate in a research effort, we could take something like that forward. I'm just interested, with all the people that are in the webinar. Maybe you should put your hands up or type in a message. Would you be interested in participating? Could we take something like this forward? But we need to see that you are committed, and there's so many people here from residential care, even though others, Mark, for your information, are practicing in communities and families, and others are practicing in schools. So we've got a lot of Izibindi, Izikuleni, school-based child and youth care workers, which are also interesting stories. So yes, so we could hear from where the interest is.
I think that's a great idea. I do think that we need to rebalance the stories that are told about residential childcare and capture some of the positive ones as well. And in that way, I think you get into some of the depth and sophistication of just what child and youth care workers do as well in that kind of relationship. But I'll make some arrangement to get a copy to you, Zenny, and I'd be very happy to, if people wanted to ask me further questions about how you might go about getting the stories.
Yes. And we've had a hand up there. Somebody else wanted to say something or ask a question? We seem to have lost. We lost someone. Yes, there's a comment here, study across the various areas in terms of the impact of care from our child and youth care workers. Someone else saying it would be great to tell our stories. Another one is saying in South Africa, there are many good practices that address issues of secure care, like restorative justice, family group conferencing, multidisciplinary meetings to work with the children in conflict with the law. In their care, time is different from children's homes as it's based on case merit. And again, it's about working together, tap on each other's strengths and resources, and ensure probation officers ensure that children receive the necessary support. Another point, absolutely a good idea, Zeni, keep child and youth care practice alive. So I think what's interesting is that there's a sense that this could keep the child and youth care sector inspired, and bring the practice out. It's a lovely, it could be a lovely initiative, and it would be lovely that it came from this webinar, that we've actually move something like this forward. Any other comments? Over to you, Elwyn.
Yes, Mark, it seems like we don't have any other comments or questions here from our participants. And at this stage, we're going to then ask our chairperson from the Northwest Province to do the vote of thanks. Carabello, if you could come in and then switch on your camera and then just do the vote of thanks for us.
Wow. My camera. Oh, I wonder how do I look. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, go ahead.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. Firstly, Mr. Mark, I would really like to thank all the participants who joined in the webinar for today, and to you, our honorable motivational speaker, Mr. Mark. On behalf of the NEC, all the social services professionals, would like to thank you for taking your time to share with us your experience as a child and youth care worker in the residential care, and for almost a decade. 19 years is a lot. I was also inspired when you said you worked how tough it is, especially in children from you as a self-care and contrasting personal lives, especially in our workplaces. Not forgetting the challenges that CCW and children go through, which have a lot of commonalities regardless which country they live in. We have also learned about the sense of together, difficult relationship between peers and staff. It's so sentimental but practical, especially when we're in the residential care. Thank you much, Mr. Mark, and please do continue to do a good work for our profession and in the publication of the book. I would also like to read that book that you mentioned in the beginning, something to do with boys' stories of their time. It will be of great help to understand and learn more, especially when we are working in the residential care with children who are in conflict with the law. In conclusion, I'd like to thank you again and thank all our leaders at large, Mel, Donald, Elwin, all the participants with the questions. It all made our webinar a very good success. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carabello, for sharing with us. We apologize, Mark, for the breakup. She's very far in the highlands, in mountains, and across the oceans that she must speak to you. But we are very grateful for you sharing with us the best years of our lives, reflections on the roots and essence of child and youth care. And what you have shared with us, stories of young people in terms of what was good about them being in residential facilities, and our story about, I read there the one comment of the young person saying, this place, the people care for us and they looked after us well because we don't have the care of parents. And I think your stories that you have shared with us and that you have taken us back is also, in a sense, reassuring our child and youth care workers, especially those in residential care, that the work that they are doing is positive. And despite all the challenges of, managing behavior, ups and downs, problems with resources, children value it. and the book tells it all, the best years of our lives. And we are grateful that you have come and inspire us here in South Africa, and the people that were in this webinar. We feel that we should also start, doing our research and pin down these good stories and follow up with those that were in care, because it builds us and tells us in terms of how we can improve on our services. Once more, on behalf of all of us here, we want to say we appreciate the time you've spent with us. We would also like, just before we then leave, maybe there's a few comments from your side that you would like to make, or Zeni, you would like to come in first?
I just wanted to say before we leave, I couldn't resist saying one comment that I think came out from the presentation when the children were saying, for example, the young people, how they experienced the warmth and the care and the soup and the smell, of food and that. And I just want to tell a quick understanding of how that can influence policy, because smells are so important for children, and the smells of the food in a residential facility matter because it gives such a homely, warm, welcoming, caring approach. In KwaZulu-Natal, and I say it in tribute to the KwaZulu-Natal child and youth care workers in residential care, the government department decided that they were going to organize catering and organize a catering company to provide food for the children and bus in, I suppose, food every day for the children, which would mean that there wouldn't be that home-cooked smell of scones and tea and soup being made. And the child and youth care workers from our institutions protested. They even walked out of a meeting that the department held, walked right out and said, we protest, we do not believe that this would be an approach that is connected in, and actually won. So the children's homes are still cooking meals for children. So some of these stories could inspire us as well to do the kinds of advocacy. So that's just something I wanted to share, Chairperson. I think
it's a
and
great
to say
story.
Thank you to KZN institutions, childcare programs that took the courage to do that.
But you only know that if you're a child and youth care worker, don't you? If you're a bureaucrat concerned about finances, you'll think, well, it's cheaper if we bring that, the food in. Whereas if you're a child and youth care worker, you realise the significance of food in terms of the smells, the preparation, all of the things that go with it. So, yeah, I'd be delighted if people could start. I think that, we've got a number of, increasingly, the likes of Facebook, you've got a number of institutions which have Facebook pages, and I'm going to suggest to some colleagues here that they try and gather stories from kids who are in particular institutions. So if that's us, I will just thank you all, and hopefully keep in touch.
Okay, thanks a lot. Can we give Mark Smith a big round of applause? I see a few hands being clapped, Mark, if you could notice them. But yeah, it's in a way of appreciation. Thank you all. And at that note, I think we then will close our session for this afternoon. And I hope to see you in the near future to be with us again, Mark. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very
Bye-bye.
appreciated.